Meghlen here with Rachel Poli, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. We are on episode 45, and this week's question is, how do you come up with names in your book? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening so you never miss a show, and if you enjoy our episode, please give it a like. Okay, so today's topic is all about names. As writers, we create a lot of names, whether it's our own name, coming up with a pen name, character names, place names, world names, the names of our books. So let's be honest, names are important. We're going to discuss where we come up with our names. I have said the word names so many times. My biggest source of names always seems to be movie credits. Kind of started using movie credits when I was in my, let's say, early teens. There was a movie, I think it was Hot Shots. Might be not, I'm not sure, but I have to check that. And I remember when I sat through it, it had silly things coming up through the credits. This was before the time where there was like end scenes after credits that you would sit through. So if you ended up staying a bit too long while the credits were going up and you caught sight of these funny things, you ended up sitting down and just reading all the credits on the off chance you'd catch one of these silly things, whether it was a comment or a recipe or a joke. And I remember I got into that and I stayed with that habit. And by doing that and scanning all these names, I would often find really unusual ones or ones that just rang perfectly for a character I was thinking about. I do it instinctively now for movies, TV shows, anything like that. I'm always looking for names. And I will then just stick them in my phone's notes app. I have a little note that's literally called names, and I just keep dropping them in all the time. And they can be for anything. They can be people names, they can be place names, they can be a name that is amended slightly to become something else. I found a lot of world names through credits where someone's last name may sound a little bit worldy if I change a couple of letters around. So yeah, movie credits have always been a big source of names for me. Names. Can't stop saying names. What about you, Rachel?
I don't know any synonyms for the word names, to be honest. So we're both going to be saying this word a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Looking through the movie credits is a really good idea and not something that I've done often. I have thought about it before, but I just don't pay too much attention. And, you know, we should all utilize that, especially if you watch the Marvel movies, because we all know you're sitting through the credits waiting for that end scene. So it would be a really good idea to actually pay attention to the names that are listed on the credits and keep a list of them. Although I have to admit, there are some movies where the credits go by so fast. You know, I don't know why they do that. But that's a good idea. I like that. And I might have to adopt that. I say I'll adopt it and then I'll forget about it. But I have to say, you mentioned that there are some names that you come up with for like world or place names that like you'll see a name under the credits and you'll modify it. See, with me, when I create names, 9 times out of 10, I pick the first name that comes to my mind. Sometimes when I'm creating a new character, I'll just like give them a random name and maybe it'll change halfway through the book, but a lot of times it'll just stick because the name will just become the character. But when you say that you'll modify certain names, like I'll do that too. Like a really great way to come up with fantasy names, in my opinion, is to take names that you already know and scramble the letters or spell the name backwards. Like my fantasy name would be Lakar. Yours would be
Ira.
Ira? But yeah, it seems so simple, but hey, it works. And because one of the big things for me is that if you're creating fantasy names, like you want to be able to pronounce it. So there are some names that you're able to scramble the letters around to make it still readable and pronounceable without it seeming like a common name, if you will. Yeah. And the same thing with spelling your name backwards. Like sometimes it'll make sense, sometimes it won't. But it's kind of fun to like list names of all the people you know and like spell their names backwards and see what you can come up with.
I like that. I also like the idea of mixing letters up because it's like, I'm sure there's programs out there that you can type that in and it makes like an anagram by shuffling letters. So you could use like, your full name, stick it in, let it shuffle around and come up with a load of different names. And then you could just pick and choose different ones. So I think that's a brilliant idea, especially, as you said, for fantasy, where those slightly unusual names always do well. I always find it weird if I'm reading a fantasy, especially like a heavy, epic fantasy, and then you're like, there'll be like a Kevin in the middle of it. You're like, whoa, I'm sorry. No, that just doesn't feel right. Certain names don't really feel the same in like fantasy. So, but you stick that name Kevin in there and you mix it around, you're going to get some great different names. So yeah, I like the idea of that. That's very clever. I'm going to try and use that if I remember.
It's a lot of fun. You'll get a couple of good laughs out of it, depending on what you can come up with. I say as I barely even write fantasy, but
it's good because you actually mix things up, and it can be quite difficult coming up with like last names, especially like if you're writing something more modern. I personally find that I get trapped in a circle of using the same like five last names, and I have to sort of force myself out of it. And otherwise, I just get obsessed with people I know using their last names, and that can get a little bit obsessive as well. So sort of mixing names and then using those as more as like just a last name, if you stay away from the fantasy, I can see that working. And I bet they're quite good for place names as well.
Right, yeah, it is. I mean, you can come up with some unique place names, but also, as you just said, the surnames. There was a website I used to use for last names, and I want to say it was surname.com, but I can't find it on my phone, so I don't know if it still exists or not, but it was this massive list of all these last names. You can do it by alphabetical order, you can do it by region, you could do it by most common, so like Smith was the number one if you do most common. So that was a useful website. I don't know, I can't find it though.
Oh, what a shame. Because it's one of those things, it's like first names, everyone's, most people are quite good at coming up with names, or picking names from wherever, but surnames are always that little bit more complicated, especially, as you said, certain surnames will be more popular depending on country, depending on region, depending on time frame, if you go back to like ancient England, I'm sure there'll be surnames that we don't have now and things like that. So they probably didn't even have surnames back then. I mean, that's where we got things like Thompson and Peterson, because it was, Peter's son, Tom's son, things like that. That's how we ended up with things like that. But yeah, so I like that. Okay, my second method is quite an old one nowadays. Most people don't seem to do this, is baby books. And I do mean books. I know there are a ton of websites online, obviously websites online. I know there's a ton of websites that have like baby names, and you can find baby names from different countries, baby names that are, I should say, like similar to that. It's like popular baby names, unusual baby names inspired from this or that. But I still like some of the older baby name books. You'll often find names that aren't on these websites. And I like that because they give you, a lot of times they'll give you a little bit more detail about the name, about maybe how it came about, where it was first used, or what it means. And I have found some of the websites that have baby names on don't have that information. They'll just be like, these are the 10 best baby names for boys, and that's it. And it doesn't tell you anything else, whereas the books often do. I do actually have somewhere, I have a little mini baby book of names that every now and then I will flick through. I do seem to obsess with going for the same letters though. I always seem to look at T's, S's, D's. I don't know why. And as I was looking through my novels recently, I was very aware of how many of my characters start with T. I mean, literally, in my Dark Heart, I've got Trinity and Tane. I had Tyler. I had to change it because three characters with the name T was just too much. In The Blessed, Thea is my main character. If you're looking for names for characters, not to get fixated on a certain letter, and you might not even realize you're doing it. And I must have, when I've been flicking through baby name books, I must have like flick and always hit the T's and go, oh, and just caught it. So I do try every now and then to force myself to look at E's or N's or G, because I don't have that many characters starting with those letters. So Yeah. Give baby books a try. Go to your local library, if you're allowed with lockdown, and see if you can find some baby books and choose some great names from that.
I love using baby books, and I will admit I don't use them as often anymore than I used to, because babynames.com is a really good website. You can search up names by, letter or gender or by meaning. And also Baby Name Genie is a really good one too. Babynamegenie.com. That's a good one. But I did used to use baby books a lot, and I actually still have a baby book that I bought, I don't know, it had to have been like 10 or 11 years ago at this point. I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought a baby name book, and I think it was the Everything book of baby names or something like that. Like there's that series called The Everything of whatever. It's probably so outdated at this point, but I bought that, and as I was leaving, the cashier looked me dead in the eye and smiled and said, "Congratulations." And I said thank you, because I didn't know what else to say. And I walked away, but I still have that book. And you say that you look at, like, you have a lot of characters that begin with T or S. Way back when I was like, when I first started writing, I would look at this baby name book and I had Post-it notes on certain pages. I mean, the names were listed alphabetically, but then there would be these little side capped things, and it would be like, oh, girls named after flowers, for example. So there would be Daisy and Rose and Lily. So I loved theme names. So a lot of times my characters were named after flowers or gemstones or the months of the year or something like that. So that's where I got. But in terms of the letters, I have to say, in my cozy mystery novel, George is one of 7 siblings. And when I came up with their names, I was afraid I was going to, do what you did. They were all going to begin with the same letter or something. So I came up with their names. I went down the alphabet. So each sibling, their names begin with A, B, C, D, E, and F, and G.
Nice.
So that's what's worked for me.
I like that. The idea of thinking like, oh, I don't want to have them all the same. So then, going out of your way and doing something different. Because you can imagine there would be parents who say they had 7 would do something like that, or the other way around, would have all of them with the exact same first initial.
Yep.
And
exactly.
that, so I kind of like the idea of that.
Yeah, well, I used to have the alphabet up whenever I wrote, like, not just my mystery series, but any book. I used to have the alphabet up, and when I created a character, I would give them a name that begins with the letter A, and then I would cross A out, and the next character that I introduced would be B, and I'd cross B out. And 9 times out of 10, I never had more than 26 characters. So nobody repeated, for the most part, I don't think. Unless there was a name that really stuck with me, and then I would just throw that in there. But
yeah.
But earlier I said that, sometimes I just come up with a name and I stick with it. I found an app on my iPad like years ago, and it's called Name Dice. If you go on the App Store and just type in Name Dice, it should be the first thing to pop up. But it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a set of dice, and you tap the screen and the dice will re-roll, and one dice will be a first name and the next dice will be a last name. And you could just keep on tapping the screen until you come up with a name that you like. And you can mix and match the names and stuff like that. So sometimes I'll do that if I'm looking for something quick, but I need just something random. Like if it's a minor character who I know is only going to be in like 1 or 2 scenes, then I'll just like pull up the Name Dice app and just keep tapping until something suitable comes along.
I like that. That's good. We'll obviously put all the links to these things in the description below if we remember.
Well, this is Ari's episode, so if she doesn't remember, blame her.
Uh-oh.
This is your episode, right? Yeah, it is.
It is. When I listen back to edit it, I'll have to actually pay attention to more than just the errors. So I can I've got to remember to add that and that.
Good luck.
Obviously, one of the biggest tips we recommend is a list, because you will always be coming up with names. There will be names you just randomly come up with, names you see in the movie credits, names you, like as Rachel mentioned with the dice app, a name might come up that you might not want to use for the character right away, because if you've got a very kind of specific idea of this character, but a name that you like might come up, write it down, stick it on a list. I personally use a spreadsheet on my main computer, and then I have my little app, my little notepad app on my phone that I sort of dump them in. And then I go back and I upload everything into my spreadsheet, and I will even put on like whether I've used those names before, and I can do a quick search for them. And it just means you've already got a bulk list of names, so that if you're starting a new story and you're thinking, really need a strong name, or a name that sounds more friendly. I know that sounds really odd, but this is how I see names. I almost resonate with a certain sense. So some names sound quite quirky, some names quite strong, some sound authoritative. So create your list, keep adding to them. You can get all the books that you want, you can use all the websites you want, but I guarantee there will be names you hear and that you see that are awesome, but not for what you're currently working on. And in that case, you probably will forget them if you don't write it down. So just write it down. It's honestly, it's brilliant, especially for, like, as I said, like for minor characters, or maybe if you want different spellings. For, you know, so if you like a certain name but you've already used it in one novel, doesn't mean you can't use it in another, but maybe change it up a little bit. Don't know, just try. But definitely build a list.
I don't have a list. I should have a list. That's really great advice, to build a list. Don't make that face at me.
I am shocked. I thought I was talking for the both of us, and now I feel wronged.
I mean, you would think that I would have a list of this stuff, but I really don't. I keep a list of names for each book, but I don't have a master list of names that like I can use if I'm stuck trying to think of a name. I'll usually, what I do is I'll text my sister, or I'll shout at her from the other room, and I'll say, give me a boy's name, give me a girl's name. And she'll just like give me a random name, and I'll just use that. And she does the same thing for me. And I usually give her the most outlandish names that I can think of. So I don't think I'm as helpful in that sense. But building a list, yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I used to think about the meanings behind the names a lot when I created characters. So having a list of names and then what they mean and their origin and stuff like that, you'd think that I would have something like that. Maybe that's something I should work on. Maybe that'll get me back into writing. Who knows? Maybe that'll inspire me to keep on going. But I want to turn the tables a little bit and talk about book titles, because we've talked a lot about character names and even a couple of ways to come up with some like setting names or world building names. But book titles is something that everybody seems to have trouble with. I don't know why. I mean, it's always been the opposite for me. I've always come up with book titles and then I create a plot around the book title. And these book titles, I did have a list of that. It was like 150 book titles long, I think. I've cut it down since then because I know there's no way I'm going to be able to write all of them. But I usually see a word or a phrase and I'm like, yeah, that would be a really good book title. And then I write it down and then a plot will eventually come. And that's actually kind of how I came up with the title for my second George Florence novel. It's called George Florence and the Anonymous Tip. And anonymous tip is such a common term for mystery stuff and detectives and police and things like that. So I thought it would make a really good title for one of my George novels. And then I forgot about the title because I didn't write it down. I love how it's ironic that writers get all these ideas and we write, but we never write down these ideas. So I forgot about the title for a little bit, and then I had this scene idea in my head for George and Lila, and I wrote that down. And then a few weeks later, I read it again, and the scene was George and Lila finding an anonymous tip about a crime. And then I remembered the title. So that kind of came together. I don't know what my point was. So I don't think I really have any tips on how to come up with book titles other than just like keep your eyes open for phrases and words around you, and because like anything can be a book title. And if you're having trouble coming up with a book title, write the book first, and then whatever a key point from that story is, you can usually pull a title from that.
Yeah, that's what I do. I am awful at book titles. Most of my titles are working title, da 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 da.
Yeah.
I don't like book titles. I used to when I was younger. I would make up titles, and it'd be like, The Curse of the Green Flame. It's like, yeah. What it's about, no idea. Obviously, there should be a curse in there. Obviously, there should be flames. And then I got halfway through the story and realized I had neither. So I tried to pull back on coming up with random titles because I would do that and not have any idea where I was going. So now what I do is I'm usually writing the book first, and then I will look for themes or symbols within the story to sort of use. And especially because most of my stories are trilogies or series, I kind of like those titles that connect. Let me try and remember some that work. Like, for example, you've got author Holly Black, who did The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King, and The Queen of Nothing. And you can see there's like a theme that runs through that. You've got Prince, King, Queen. Or there's the novels by James Clemens that was Witchfire, Witch Storm, Witch War, etc., etc. So they had kind of a running theme. I like that sort of style for series titles. And that's what I've been looking at when I've been working on my Dark Heart series. So if you are thinking of writing a series or a trilogy, you might want to think about whether you want the titles to link, or whether you want them to be so different, or whether you want them to be stylized the same. So obviously, if your first novel is written with just like 2 words, like I'm going to just pick up random words like Black Flame. Obviously, I've got obsession with flame. And then your second novel, you probably don't want it to be, the whispering song of death in the cavern, because it doesn't really, it kind of jars against the first one. So I think you need a little bit more thought into your titles of your books if they're a series. I think it works really well. Like Rachel's, I believe yours all start with George Florence, and so that's how you've stylized yours. And it is something you need to think about like that. It can make a big difference. I think one of the main things is your titles of your books. Says me, who hasn't really written great titles. I think the titles of your books need to have some connection to what the story is about. Because obviously you don't want someone picking up a book that's titled, Love's Sweet Embrace, and it's a dark tragedy and it's got nothing to do with love in it. Because that would be upsetting to people who are suddenly going, oh, it sounds like a romance. I find that book titles are almost as important as book covers. What do you think? Because I think it's one of those things that grabs you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you need the title to connect with the cover as well.
Yeah.
I have read a couple of books. I can't think of their names at the moment, and I don't know if I would want to name them. I don't know if I want to call them out, but I have read some books where I look at the cover and it's gorgeous, and then I read the book and I'm like, what did the boat on the cover have to do with anything? Just for example, like, you need it, everything needs to tie together. The title, the cover, the actual story, it has to tie together. And I have to agree with you. I like it when series do connect or link to each other and they have similar titles to each other. It's just aesthetically pleasing.
Yes.
And it's just uniform, and it's great. Obviously, you don't have to do that. As long as the title goes along with the story, that's fine. You do not need to have the titles linked to each other. But personal preference, I like that.
Yeah, me too.
The readers.
But we're readers, and we have our opinion is just as valid. But I think what you said is it's aesthetic, and it really is. And also, I find the ones where the titles kind of like connect to each other, the images on the front do. So if you take, I'm going to probably butcher this woman's name, Victoria Aveyard, who did the Red Queen sort of stories.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
No. She wrote the Red Queen, and then it was the Glass Sword, the King's Cage, the War Storm, and obviously, it's just 2 words each time. And then the same with the imagery, the first one was the crown upside down that had blood coming off it and things like that. And so you get these book covers that sort of like have this beautiful aesthetic look that almost like match each other. But yeah, so I think book titles and series titles are always harder than character titles. Or you could always do what Rachel did, like you've actually used your character title, your character's name in the title of your book. So I kind of like that.
That was because I couldn't think of anything else. Because you want to talk about series for a minute. Series titles, I have no clue about. Like, I mean, my mystery series is the George Florence series, because I don't know what else to call it. And just having the title like The Perfect Alibi or The Anonymous Tip, for some reason that didn't sound right with me. So it's George Florence and The Perfect Alibi, George Florence #1. which is like obnoxiously long. So I don't really know if it's going to stick that way. But I mean, series names, forget that. I have no tips on that because I don't even know what I'm doing with it.
That's so weird because I can come up with series titles easier, but I like that kind of where a series title can be the character's name, because my Dark Heart is the name of the first book, and I've been using it as kind of the series title whenever I talk about that series, but its official series title is the Trinity Heart series, and that's the character's name, and then Dark Heart is the first book, and obviously I think the Blessed series, that's the series name, because I haven't come up with the first book's title, and that's how I do it. I think I've got the Darkling series, I've got the Shadowblade series, so I've got really great names for those. It's these book titles themselves, I have no idea, but I kind of like the idea of, especially if you're not sure, you could use the character's name, and you might not even need a series title then, because it's kind of obvious, because I said you've got George Florence and the Anonymous Tip, George Florence and the Perfect Alibi, so it's already known that that is a series. So I think that works really well. Even if you didn't want that to be an official series title, it is in itself self-contained, so you'll be fine.
That's a good point. Thank you. Because we're done here, I'm gonna go scratch out all my series.
Yeah, I think this episode feels like it's been going on for ages, or it might just be that I've got a shed load of stuff to cut out because we botched up so much throughout. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please do share with us how you pick your characters' names, place names, book titles, and drop in those tips in the comments or on Twitter using the hashtag The Mayor Writer Podcast. We promise we will try and check that hashtag. Do you want some extra content? Then do head over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/The Mayor Writer Podcast. You can support our show for as little as $1 a month and get yourself some great extra bonus content. Don't forget to tune in next week for another episode of The Mayor Writer Podcast, where we ask all the right questions. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast is brought to you by Writing Distractions. We're stalling on our whips. The music, titled Inspired, is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.